So today we're going to talk about the respiratory system. Oh, this doesn't even say that. It says fundamentals. Anyway, we're going to talk about the respiratory system, the lungs, the bronchi, etc., etc. We're going to start by talking about the functional anatomy. As we've been doing with our topics, we're going to do the anatomy first, and then we'll do the physiology second. And then we'll sort of walk our way through all of these different and varying topics. So when we talk about respiration, we talk about the act of breathing and gas exchange. We have different terms for this. We have the pulmonary ventilation, which is the physical breathing in and out, exchanging of air. External respiration basically means the gas exchange in the lungs, the transport of gases in the cardiovascular system to the tissues, and then internal respiration, which is gas exchange at the tissue level. Now, the major organs of the respiratory system include the nasal cavity, basically the throat, the pharynx, larynx, and then the trachea, bronchi, and lungs. Now, we have the upper respiratory system would be from the nose to the larynx being the voice box. The nose, right, warms and moistens the air, cleans it, resonance chamber for speech, that kind of stuff. The interior of the nasal cavity is lined with oily sweat glands, and we've got mucous membranes. So there's all kinds of stuff going on in there. The olfactory mucosa contains smell receptors, and the respiratory mucosa contains goblet cells with mucus and other antibacterial lysozymes, defensins. So there's a lot of secretions happening in the upper respiratory system. We have the nasal concha, which you can see there right at the top here. Right, these are going to, again, to sort of turbinate the air so that anything that's in the air will stick to the mucus. And again, filtering and taking out anything that doesn't really belong. As we move down right through the pharynx, we have three regions of the pharynx. Goodness, that's a lot of nose there. Okay, we did a lot of nose. Sorry. One picture of the overall respiratory system, a second image of the overall respiratory system broken up by upper and lower respiratory. Here we have a picture of the respiratory epithelia with the mucus glands, and sort of showing that layer of mucus on the outside that's capturing certain little particles. Here we have the picture of the nose and the various bones and cartilages associated with the nose. The nasal concha right here, the different turbinates, inferior, middle, and superior nasal concha. Again, with the external nares, the nostril, air will come in here, warm, moisten, things stick to the mucus, and it goes down the back of the throat. Once we leave the nasal cavity, we enter what's called the pharynx, and the pharynx is the nasopharynx behind the nose, the oropharynx behind the mouth, and the laryngopharynx behind the larynx. And it's basically what we would consider the throat. Now, if we continue posteriorly down the pharynx, we will end up down the esophagus. The air for the respiratory system is going to go in the nose, through the naso and oro and laryngopharynx, and then down into the larynx. So the posterior goes to the stomach, the anterior goes to the lungs. All right, so here we have the pharynx. So basically the pharynx's job is just to conduct the air and food from the nose and mouth down to wherever it's going to go next. Again, upper respiratory system, description and function. Another picture of the upper respiratory system, including the larynx, and we're going to get into this area here because we're going to go from the nose and mouth anteriorly through the vocal folds, vocal cords and vocal fold, down into the larynx, the trachea, and then into the lungs. Now, the larynx is an open airway. It routes food and air into the proper passageway. So the air is going to come down and go down into the larynx. Food would go from the tongue. It's going to push down this flap, the epiglottis, and go down the back of the throat into the esophagus. So this blue line here is called the epiglottis. And this is a little ligament here that attaches to the hyoid bone, and this little flap closes and opens and closes and opens for the air to pass through and the food to pass behind. So that's the epiglottis. There's all different types of cartilages for the larynx, right? We have the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilages, the tracheal cartilages. There's all kinds of little cartilages in here. There's a side view or a cross section, all right? But this is the hyoid bone. This would be the Adam's apple, right? And then down here we would have the trachea. So this is the whole larynx, epiglottis. The upper fold is the false vocal cord. This is the true vocal cord, true vocal fold that gives us our voice. And then the different cartilages that control the opening and closing, the shape of the vocal cord as your voice goes up and down, those types of things. As the length and tension of the vocal folds increase or decrease, that's how you get a higher pitch or a lower pitch to your voice. And that all has to do with these different arytenoid muscles, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the larynx. All right, again, anterior view, side view, opened and closed vocal folds. And then we end up down into the lung. We have the trachea, which is cartilaginous, surrounded by hyaline cartilage rings, down basically behind the mediastinum where it splits into your two lungs. We have the left and the right lung. You'll notice how there are two lobes on the left lung, the superior and inferior. There are three lobes on the right lung, superior, middle, and inferior. The heart sort of nestles right in here, so you can see the little nook where the heart would be. These are called the bronchi, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi, all ending up in a what's called an alveolus, which we'll look at in a minute. Now, the trachea is lined with ciliated pseudostratified epithelia, right, to take that mucus up and out and then back down your esophagus. The trachea is lined with C-shaped rings. They don't go all the way around, so those blue hyaline rings only are like this, so that as food passes, right, they're able to open and close and allow for a little expansion back there. So the trachea diverge into the primary bronchus, into the secondary bronchus, the tertiary bronchus, and the bronchioles. And again, here you can see the cartilaginous rings. You can see the extension of the trachea from the larynx to the bronchi. You can see here the C-shaped ring here, right? And then this is the esophagus here. This is called a trachealis muscle here. It's going to open and close the trachea, hold it tight. You can see here the ciliated pseudostratified epithelia, which is going to be in place to move things up and out. All right, so there's an awful lot of structural and functional stuff happening here, especially when we get down to the alveoli. This is one layer of simple squamous epithelia, very good for the gas exchange. All right, so we have the trachea, the bronchus, primary, secondary, tertiary, the terminal bronchiole, surrounded by, this is not hyaline, this is smooth muscle, this red, ending in the alveoli. The alveoli is where the gas exchange happens. Right, and in a second, we're going to see how well vascular the alveoli are. So we have the vein coming down. We're going to pick up some oxygen, and we're going to send that oxygen back to the heart. Right, so it comes out the pulmonary arteries, down to the capillaries, and back through the pulmonary veins to the heart. The smooth muscle here, right, the role of that smooth muscle is going to be to open and close the bronchi depending on how much oxygen is needed, right? We're going to constrict and dilate those muscles to ensure the appropriate airflow, right, in the lungs. And we'll talk about that when we do physiology. Now, the alveoli are one single layer of squamous epithelia. You can see that right here, right? It also has some of these macrophages and some other different, we got the capillary in here. There's all kinds of different stuff going on. These are going to be the alveolar cells that secrete the surfactant, right, to hold open those alveoli. And the external surface of the alveoli are densely covered by a web of pulmonary capillaries that you can see right here. And basically it's going to be the respiratory membrane where the gas exchange occurs, which you can see right here, right? So oxygen is going in from the lung where you just inhaled into the blood. Carbon dioxide coming back from the body is going to leave the blood and enter the lungs for exhalation, right? So remember what's happening here. As blood passes by the lungs, it is deoxygenated blood. It's going to the lungs to pull oxygen into the bloodstream, right? It's also going to allow the carbon dioxide to be expelled from the body as it returns from the tissues. Now, the lungs occupy most of the thoracic cavity. Most of the lung volume is going to be these little alveoli. The alveoli are, again, heavily vascular. The bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle. It's right next to, it's to increase and decrease the diameter of the bronchioles, right? And we'll get to that in a minute. So here we have the lungs in the thoracic cavity. So it's part of the ventral body cavity. It's part of the thoracic cavity. And each lung is in the pleural cavity, right? We have pleural, parietal, and pericardial pleura that surround the serous membrane that surrounds the lungs, right? Again, this is a picture of the right and left lung, the lobes, how the bronchiopulmonary segments sort of provide for gas exchange in the lungs, etc. This is another interesting one, right? It's sort of live, but without the tissue. Very cool picture. All right, so now let's talk about respiratory physiology. Right, so respiratory physiology is the volume changes, it's the respiratory pressures, it's how we actually breathe. It is a pressure thing. So the diaphragm that sits underneath the lungs, when the diaphragm is at rest, it's like this. And when it contracts, it shortens and it contracts like this. And so you can see how when it goes from an arch to a straight, right, we have a pulling down. So when the diaphragm goes from this to this, it pulls down. So when the diaphragm contracts and goes lower, right, the pressure inside the lungs is going to be lower. So that's going to cause us to go, right, pulling in because we're pulling down the lungs. So it's like, you inhale, right, when the diaphragm goes down, air flows in. When the diaphragm relaxes, air pushes out. And so it's all about pressure. When the interpulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure, we're going to pull in, right? When the interpulmonary pressure, when the diaphragm relaxes, then the air is going to flow out. So inspiration and expiration is all based on the contraction of the diaphragm. So inspiration is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles contract. And when that happens, the volume increases. When the volume increases, that means the pressure drops. When the pressure drops, air flows into the lungs. It's a little bit tough to understand. When you want to really pull in a lot of air, then you're going to really pull the neck and thorax back. You're going to go, you pull your muscles out, right? You contract those muscles, you get extra volume, again, more air. Quiet expiration, all you do is you stop contracting your diaphragm and the muscle recoils, pushing the air out. So it's all about pressure, all about pressure. So this is called pulmonary ventilation, right? Pulling the gas flow in and out of the lungs according to the volume changes. So when the interpulmonary pressure is lower than the atmospheric pressure, air goes in. When the interpulmonary pressure then gets higher, then obviously the air will go out. So when we talk about, why do I have this? When we talk about the inspiration and the expiration and what's happening, this is a really, really great flow chart, right? How the muscles happen, how the volume increases, how the pressure drops, right? This is perfect. And I really think that you should take some time to really look at this. Muscles contract, volume increases, pressure goes down, air goes in. Relax, volume decreases, lungs recoil, pulmonary pressure rises, air comes out. All right, so it's about pressure. But take some time with this one. It's a really great image. This just gives you a little bit of an idea of how the diaphragm contracts. It actually contracts from a superior position to a more inferior anterior. So it kind of, think of it as a swinging bucket. It kind of goes like this. It's not just up and down. It's in and out and in and out. And sort of, let me see if I can get my hand to do it. In and out, in and out. So it's not up and down really. It's more like a bucket that swings like this. Again, at rest, the rib cage and diaphragm are at rest. The pressure inside are equal. There's no air movement. You're just sitting. Right? However, when you inhale, the volume increases, right? The pressure outside is greater than the pressure inside, and air flows in. When you exhale, diaphragm relaxes, thoracic cavity pressure size decreases, pressure increases, and air goes out. When we talk about the physical factors that influence pulmonary ventilation, I'm going to go back to this. What are the things that are going to influence how easy it is to breathe in and out? There's basically three things. One is called airway resistance. All right, and that's the resistance are going to be in the medium-sized bronchi, right? The diameter of the bronchi. If they're relaxed, there's less resistance. If they're tight, there's more resistance. So the airway resistance is the friction caused by the air in the airways. If the wider open they are, the better. Alveolar surface tension. When you look at these little alveoli, they are very round and very open. Well, what cells want to do is collapse, right? They want to collapse onto each other. So the more open they are, right, the better. So alveolar surface tension is the force that must be overcome to inflate the lungs. All right, so water tries to reduce it, and surfactant opens them up. So we want to have surfactant so that they're as open as possible, so it's very easy for air to go in. So we have airway resistance, which is the friction of the air in the airway. The more open, the better. The smaller, the tighter, more difficult. Alveoli, we want them to be open. The more collapsed they are, the harder it is for us to expand them. If they're already expanded, then it's easier for gas to flow in. And then the third thing is how extensible, how elastic is your lung tissue, right? The lung tissue has a certain structure to it, but you can improve the pliability and the stretchability of your lungs. By doing breathing exercises, by doing cardiovascular activity, you can increase the stretchability, the lung compliance. So what affects this? Three things. Airway resistance, alveolar surface tension, and lung compliance. Three things that are going to affect how easy it is to breathe. When we want to talk about breathing, there are different things, different volumes that we would like to, or we need to measure, right? And you can take some time to look over these. If we were doing a lab face-to-face, we would be actually working with a spirometer, working with tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, etc. And each one of them is basically a measure of inhalation, exhalation, resting breathing, right? And they're all in volumes, like there's a normal, quote unquote, normal amount. But the amounts given on this page are for about 150 to 160 pound person. And so don't use these numbers, right, as sort of the be all end all. They are variable per person, and they, and again, these ones are for like 150 pound person. So why would we do this, right? Why would we need to know this? You want to know your volumes or what an appropriate volume should be so that if you're doing any kind of pulmonary function test, for asthma, for COPD, for emphysema, any of those pulmonary function tests, you want to make sure that you know what a normal number is so that you can see if somebody has something that's abnormal, right? Are they having an inspiration problem, an expiration problem? Like what is the issue? Ooh, we're having a CO2 problem. So you want to know about these so that when people are doing testing, right, they'll know what is a appropriate number and what is not an appropriate number. This is, again, another way to diagram that, right? The differences between males and females and the reserve volumes, lung capacities, etc. Now we're going to get into gas exchange. So when we get to exchange gases either in the lungs or in the tissues, again, it comes down to pressure. It's like any other diffusion, more to less, high to low, right? And so when the blood picks up oxygen in your lungs, it has a high oxygen content. The tissues that have been using oxygen pretty readily have a low oxygen content. So the high to low, it's going to flow from the blood into the tissues. When we get to the tissues, there's a higher amount of carbon dioxide in the tissues because we've been respiring and all of that. So that carbon dioxide is high in the tissue but low in the blood because we just exhaled. So the blood has low carbon dioxide. The tissues have high carbon dioxide. It's going to spill from the tissue into the blood. And it all comes down to basically the partial pressure of the gas in each location. So gases have basic properties as defined by what's called Dalton's law of partial pressure, and the other Henry's law. Now Henry's law describes how gases move, and Dalton's law reveals how a gas behaves in a mixture of gases. And basically, the total pressure exerted from the each gas, right, should equal 100%. So, what does that have to do with anything? The pressure of the gas in the blood and the tissue, the difference is going to make it go from high to low, whether it's carbon dioxide or oxygen into or out of the tissue. So here we are at the lung alveoli at the top. Now the alveoli at the lung, you just inhaled, you have a lot of oxygen. So high red, you just exhaled, so low carbon dioxide. Great. So the air has a lot of oxygen. It's going to flow into the blood. Follow this down, right? So now we have a lot of oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide. Goes into the heart, it goes down to the tissues. Now, here the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is less than 40, right? The partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 100. So that means it's going to go from the 100, from the blood, into the tissue, which has 40. Okay, notice that the carbon dioxide number is higher than 45 in the tissue. Notice that it's 40 in the blood. What's going to happen? It's going to go from the tissue, 45, into the blood. So now when we get over here, we notice that our carbon dioxide number has gone up and our oxygen has gone down because we've dropped off oxygen in the tissues and we've picked up carbon dioxide. We're going to go back to the heart and we're going to go back to the lungs. When we get here, again, notice the difference. Carbon dioxide is high, carbon dioxide is low, so out it goes. Oxygen is low, oxygen is high, so in it comes. So really, we're just looking at the partial pressures, we're looking at the numbers. High to low, it's really, really the ultimate case of simple diffusion. Again, external respiration. We have the alveolus and we have the blood. Oxygen's going to flow into the blood. Carbon dioxide is going to flow out of the blood. Internal respiration. We have more oxygen in the blood, so it's going to flow into the cells, right? 95 to 40, high to low. Here we have 45 is high, 40 is low, so carbon dioxide is going to go this way. It's very simple. So it's basically the opposite gradient, right, with the same control. It's all controlled by diffusion and partial pressure. where we have more to less, more to less, more to less, right? Here we have the flow as a result of how much time in the capillary. So here we have the pressure of oxygen is low, right? This is a pulmonary capillary. It's in the lung. So what's happening in the lung? What's happening in the lung? Oxygen is going in. Well, that's what we see. Start out at 40, oxygen goes in, and now we're at 100, and we're fully loaded with oxygen in a matter of 1 second in the pulmonary capillary, right? This is surrounding the alveoli. This is picking up oxygen. Now, we talk about the ventilation perfusion coupling, right? If the ventilation is less than the perfusion, right, we're going to constrict. If the ventilation is greater than the perfusion, we're going to dilate. And this is a control of how much oxygen is able to enter the tissues, right? The ventilation perfusion coupling ensures a close match between the amount of gas reaching the alveoli and the blood flow in the pulmonary capillaries. And so what we want to do is that so that they balance, we're going to constrict and dilate the various arterioles. Let's see. So let's talk about the effect of temperature on oxygen, right? So temperature, blood pH, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the amount in the blood is all going to influence hemoglobin saturation. So how much hemoglobin can the body absorb? Can each cell absorb? I mean, how much oxygen can each red blood cell absorb, right, is going to be affected by temperature, pH, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, these are little arrows. This is how the carbon dioxide is traveling from the tissues into the blood. This is how the oxygen is traveling from the blood into the tissues. Mostly on hemoglobin, some in plasma. These two guys, right? Carbonic anhydrase, blah, 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 a little bit in plasma, a little bit binding to plasma proteins. So we have the carbon dioxide moving in, right, at the tissues. Here we have carbon dioxide release at the lungs, basically reverse. All of these images are just showing you how the oxygen and carbon dioxide move and why. So the first one was depending on the partial pressures, depending on basically the concentration of each in the blood. These images are showing you how exactly they are carried. So some of them are, like for carbon dioxide, free carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma, some attached to the hemoglobin, right, and some attached to and creating what's called the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. There's a whole thing happening here. Oxygen basically travels on hemoglobin, most of it, with a little freely dissolved in the plasma. You don't have to know a lot about this, but just sort of understand the big picture that the differences in pressure is what affects the change of the exchange of the gases. So let's move to figuring out how we control respiration, right? The respiratory centers in the brain control the breathing with input from chemoreceptors and higher brain centers. So we're going to talk about the two areas in the medulla called the ventral respiratory group, VRG, and the dorsal respiratory group, the DRG, and then something called the pontine respiratory center. So what do they each do? So the ventral respiratory group here is going to be the rhythm generator, right? So that's going to be the one that controls the contraction of the diaphragm and the intercostals. So there's a rhythm to it, in, out, in, out. The dorsal respiratory group is going to moderate, right, and communicate information. Comes from the sensory input, modifies the rhythm. By modifying the rhythm, what we're saying is faster or slower. And then the pontine respiratory group modifies the rhythm, prevents overinflation of the lungs. Right, so the three of these, the VRG, the DRG, and the pontine, all work together to make sure that The inhalation and exhalation are appropriate. You're not overinflating, underinflating. The rhythm, how many breaths per minute is appropriate, based on whether you're exercising or whether you're just, sitting, watching TV, right? Your amount, depth of respiration is going to be different. The dorsal respiratory group communicates via the phrenic nerve that innervates the diaphragm. So that you want to make sure that we know about this too. So the phrenic nerve takes the information to in the intercostal nerves from this region of the brainstem and says, okay, diaphragm, contract, relax. How often? How deeply? How much contraction? Is it just a little, like, or is it a big one? So that's all the pontine respiratory center, ventral and dorsal respiratory group of the medulla, and the phrenic and intercostal nerves. So how do these guys do their job, right? How does the pontine respiratory group, or how do the respiratory centers know when to increase respiratory rate or depth, right? So there's a whole variety of things. The most important ones are going to be carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen, or pH. Over here, these chemoreceptors are probably the most important ones because those are going to be the ones that influence breathing rate and depth the fastest, the quickest, and the most often. We have chemoreceptors in the medulla and peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic arch and the carotid artery. And so these guys are going to be monitoring oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, right? And it's going to tell the lungs or tell the diaphragm what to do. So for carbon dioxide, rising carbon dioxide results in an increase in hydrogen ions. Increase in hydrogen ions decreases the blood pH. Oxygen, obviously we want to make sure that we have enough oxygen in the body. So obviously decreasing oxygen is going to cause our respiration rate to go up. Then other things that sort of peak in are going to be things like receptors in the muscles and joints, irritant receptors. Say something gets in and you cough, right? That's an irritant receptor. Stretch receptors of the lungs. Maybe you'd have a big yawn or you need, something like that, but you won't overinflate because of the stretch receptors. But mostly we're going to talk about chemoreceptors that are going to be the largest factor in determining the rate and depth. The hypothalamus and the rest of the limbic system and the cerebral cortex can also have some control. Normally you don't think about breathing, but you can think about it. If I want to breathe fast, I can go, right? My higher brain center overrode, right, what my body wanted to do. So, again, mostly chemoreceptors, also also stretch receptors, irritant receptors, higher brain centers, pain, emotion, right? If you stub your toe, you go, ow, right? You take a big inhale, right? And that's a pain receptor. Or if you're sad, you're like, right? Crying is an alternate method of breathing when you're sobbing and pushing out the air. So that's an emotional stimulus. So there's all kinds of different things that can affect the rate and depth of your breath by altering or stimulating the respiratory centers. Mostly it's chemo. Some of it is going to be sort of voluntary. Others are going to be involuntary. All right, so pay attention to that one a little bit. This is just talking about carbon dioxide going up and what happens. This one is showing you the different nerves involved, right? And then we get to the quiz questions. So I know that when you guys watch these, I fully realize that I speak really quickly. It is difficult to sit here, with nobody looking at me, nobody asking questions. I just sort of go through it. So I apologize if they're too speedy. I apologize if I'm not telling you all the things you want to know. I'm just giving you the high points, right? Please contact me if you want any more explanation on some of these high points. Access the lecture notes, access the PowerPoint, review them slowly on your own, and contact me with any questions. Peace.